The sound of crystal clinking against crystal didn't just fill the underground casino, it echoed through the smoke-heavy air with a delicate, mocking fragility, like bones breaking in slow motion. At the center of the velvet-wrapped Baccarat table sat a man who believed he owned the very luck that others prayed for. Jung Si-woo was a man of sharp suits and even sharper violence, a high-ranking figure in a syndicate where power was measured by the weight of one's bankroll and the depth of one's cruelty. He was wearing a pristine black suit, the white shirt beneath it crisp as fresh money, a dark, intricate tattoo crawling up the right side of his neck like a serpent marking its territory. That tattoo alone signaled decades of blood, loyalty, and the kind of ruthlessness that turned men into legends and corpses into warnings. He looked toward the far corner of the casino floor, where a woman stood quietly, holding a silver tray of champagne flutes and fresh linen napkins. She was wearing a traditional dark navy blue maid's uniform, the fabric stiff and immaculate, a stark white ruffled apron tied at her waist, and a matching lace headpiece that framed her face with an old-world formality. She was in her early 30s, her expression unreadable, a mask of calm professionalism that made her appear as though she existed in a different dimension than the chaos around her. She was the kind of person men like Si-woo looked at without ever actually seeing. "Hey, Diane," Si-woo called out, his voice slicing through the murmur of the room with a mocking sort of playfulness that made his inner circle of suited henchmen lean forward in hungry anticipation. "You've been polishing these tables for 3 years. You've watched fortunes won, watched fortunes lost, watched men cry into their scotch like children. Tell me, do you think you've learned enough to give the boss a little entertainment?" The room didn't just laugh, it roared. The younger men, desperate to feed their leader's ego, howled and slapped the felt-covered tables. They saw a maid in a blue dress. They saw a woman whose only job was to wipe away the sweat of their greed. They didn't see the way her feet were planted, perfectly parallel beneath the hem of her uniform, weight distributed with a mathematical precision that suggested she was measuring the distance to a target. They didn't see the way her eyes, sharp, calm, and unsettlingly focused, were already calculating variables they couldn't begin to comprehend. Diane didn't smile, and she didn't look down. She simply set the tray on a nearby serving cart, her movements fluid and devoid of wasted energy, like a blade being returned to its sheath. "I'm just here to work, Mr. Jung," she said, her voice a low, steady hum that seemed to vibrate beneath the noise of the crowd, a frequency only predators recognized. But Si-woo wasn't looking for an excuse. He was looking for a spectacle. He wanted to humiliate the very idea of service, to crush it beneath the heel of his Ferragamo loafers and make it entertainment for the wolves that surrounded him. He rose from his chair with theatrical slowness, gesturing toward the empty seat across from him with a curled finger, a gesture meant to diminish her to the size of an insect. "Come on, Diane, just one hand. A joke for the boys. Show them that even the help can bet a chip or two." He didn't know that the silence that followed wasn't born of her fear, but of the sudden, heavy realization settling over the room like a held breath. The air felt thicker, colder, as if the temperature had dropped 5 degrees the moment she took her first step toward the table. It was as though winter itself had walked through the gilded doors and decided to stay. The casino was a sanctuary of excess for some, but for Si-woo and his men, it was a theater of ego. Located in a hidden basement beneath a luxury hotel in the heart of the city, the facility was state-of-the-art, smelling of aged leather, expensive floor wax, and the faint metallic tang of desperation. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls above tables dressed in emerald felt. Around the perimeter of the main floor, 30 of Si-woo's most loyal enforcers stood like statues in tailored suits, their eyes fixed on the mismatched pair. They were young men with scarred knuckles and Rolex watches, men conditioned to believe that the tattoo on Si-woo's neck made him untouchable, that the black cards in his wallet made him a god. In their eyes, Diane Rogers was a ghost in a blue uniform. She was the one who arrived at 4 a.m. to polish the chandeliers until they blazed like miniature suns. She was the one who left at 2 a.m. after the last bottle of Dom Perignon had been drained and the last cigar stub crushed into crystal. She was invisible. She was the background music of their violence, the wallpaper of their greed. Diane stepped toward the Baccarat table, her sensible black shoes clicking softly against the marble before she paused at the edge of the playing area. She slipped them off without ceremony, revealing feet that had spent years standing, watching, and waiting. Her posture remained impossibly straight, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze fixed forward with a piercing, almost surgical intensity. She wasn't looking at Si-woo, she was looking through him, past the arrogance and the tattoos, into the hollow space where fear lived. Si-woo's grin widened, a predator baring teeth. He gestured to the dealer, a silent man with dead eyes, who had seen too many lives ruined to care about one more. "Deal her in," Si-woo commanded, his voice thick with the pleasure of anticipated humiliation. "Let's see what 3 years of watching has taught our little maid." The dealer's hands moved with mechanical precision, cards sliding across felt like whispers of fate. The room held its breath. The roulette wheel in the corner spun lazily, its metallic voice a soft, rhythmic clicking that sounded disturbingly like the cylinder of a revolver being loaded, one chamber at a time. And Diane Rogers, the woman they thought was invisible, sat down in the chair across from the man who believed he owned the world. She folded her hands on the table. She didn't tremble. She didn't blink. She simply waited for the game to begin. Welcome to Afro Soul Storybook. Subscribe to watch more of our daily stories and comment where you're watching. The chandeliers began their transformation at 4:17 a.m., when the last drunk had been poured into a sedan and the last poker chip had been raked into the house vault. Diane Rogers stood on the third rung of an aluminum ladder, her navy blue uniform still crisp despite the 14-hour shift that had preceded this moment, and she polished crystal with the same methodical precision a surgeon used to close an incision. Each prism had to catch the light at precisely the right angle. Each teardrop of glass had to hang without a single fingerprint to dull its brilliance. This was not about cleanliness. This was about invisibility, the kind of perfection that made people forget you existed. But while her hands moved in their practiced rhythm, her eyes were doing something else entirely. From her elevated position, she could see the entire main floor of the casino spread out below like a chessboard, waiting for pieces to return. She could see the Baccarat table where the felt had been scorched by a cigar 3 nights ago, the burn mark now hidden beneath a strategically placed ashtray. She could see the roulette wheel that favored red by a margin of 1.3% due to a manufacturing defect no one had noticed except her. She could see the private poker room where the doorframe had been scratched by a man trying to escape his debt, the gouges still there beneath a fresh coat of paint. And she remembered everything, every hand, every tell, every tremor. She had watched Kim Dae-jung, the shipping magnate, that heavy on banker hands whenever his left eyelid twitched, a nervous tic triggered by dehydration he developed after his 3rd whiskey. She had watched Choi Min-ho, the real estate developer, always split 8s when his wife texted him, the glow of his phone under the table like a beacon of distraction. She had watched Jung Si-woo himself, the man who owned this temple of vice, smooth his tie precisely twice before bluffing, a gesture so subtle his own men had never caught it. For 3 years, Diane had been a ghost. She had served champagne to men who spoke openly about murder, as though discussing the weather. She had cleaned blood from bathroom tiles after disagreements were settled with fists and broken bottles. She had wiped down tables where fortunes changed hands with less ceremony than a grocery transaction. And through it all, she had compiled a mental database more comprehensive than any surveillance system, more accurate than any security recording. The small silver bird pin on her collar, a delicate thing that looked like a sentimental trinket, perhaps a gift from a grandmother, caught the light as she descended the ladder. No one had ever asked about it. No one had ever looked at her long enough to notice, which was exactly the point. The pin had been recording every word spoken in this room for 1,095 days. Every bribe, every threat, every confession made in the language of men who believed themselves untouchable. She folded the ladder with practiced efficiency and moved it to the next chandelier. The casino would open again in 5 hours. The wolves would return to feed. And she would be here, invisible as always, watching them devour themselves. The losing streak began the way they always did, with a hand that should have won. Jung Si-woo had been riding a wave of confidence for 2 weeks, his chip stack growing like a tumor, malignant and unstoppable. He had taken $250,000 from a Russian arms dealer. He had broken a Japanese tech executive so thoroughly, the man had to be carried out weeping. He had crushed a local politician who had foolishly believed his government salary qualified him to play with monsters. But tonight, the cards had turned against him like a lover gone cold. The first loss was a banker hand that should have been a statistical certainty. The second was a player bet that defied every probability model. By the third loss, Si-woo's jaw had begun to tighten, the muscles beneath his tattooed neck pulsing like snakes beneath skin. By the fifth loss, his inner circle had stopped laughing and started exchanging nervous glances. Diane was refilling water glasses at the bar when she heard the sound, a wet, meaty thud followed by the crystalline crash of breaking glass. She didn't flinch. She had heard that sound before. It was the sound of a man's face meeting the edge of a marble table, followed by the tumbler of scotch that had been in his hand exploding against the floor. "You signaled him!" Si-woo's voice was a roar, his accent thickening with rage, as he grabbed the dealer by the throat and slammed him against the wall. The dealer's face was already swelling, blood streaming from his nose in twin rivers that stained his white shirt. "You fucking signaled the other player! I saw you!" The accused man wheezed something that might have been a denial, but Si-woo wasn't interested in truth. He was interested in blood, in scapegoats, in anyone or anything he could sacrifice to the gods of his own ego to explain why luck had abandoned him. Diane set down the pitcher of water and moved closer, her presence so unremarkable that none of the 30 men in the room registered her approach. She could see the dealer's eyes already starting to glaze, his oxygen-starved brain beginning to shut down. She could see Si-woo's knuckles going white as his grip tightened. She could see the precise moment the dealer's body would go limp, somewhere between 45 and 60 seconds from now. But then Si-woo released him, letting the man crumple to the floor like discarded laundry. He turned to face his inner circle, his chest heaving, his eyes wild with the particular madness of powerful men confronting their own mortality. "This place is cursed," Si-woo hissed, and Diane could hear the fear beneath the fury. "My own dealers are turning against me. My own luck has betrayed me." One of his lieutenants, a scarred man named Park, who had survived 3 assassination attempts, cleared his throat carefully. "Perhaps, sir, you need a reset, a change of energy at the table." Si-woo's eyes narrowed. "What are you suggesting?" Park's gaze drifted, almost accidentally, though nothing in this room was ever accidental, towards Diane, who was now crouched down collecting shards of broken glass with a small dustpan. "The help," he said slowly, a smile spreading across his face like oil on water. "Let the maid play your hand, transfer your bad luck onto someone who doesn't matter, someone beneath fortune's notice." The room went silent. Even the soft mechanical whir of the roulette wheel seemed to pause. Si-woo's face transformed, rage giving way to something worse, cruel delight. He looked at Diane as though seeing her for the first time, and the expression in his eyes was the look of a child who had just found an insect to pull the wings from. "Diane," he called out, his voice suddenly smooth as silk over razors, "put down your dustpan and come here." She rose slowly, her movements economical and precise. She set the dustpan on the bar, she folded her cleaning cloth into a perfect square. She walked towards the Baccarat table with the measured pace of someone walking to a gallows, her sensible black shoes clicking against marble in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. The jeering started before she reached the table. "Look at her! One of the younger enforcers cackled, a man with gold teeth and the dead eyes of someone who had killed before his voice finished changing. She probably doesn't even know how to hold the cards. Another joined in, his voice thick with the particular cruelty of men who had never been challenged. Maybe she'll clean the table instead of playing it. Si-woo stood at the head of the Baccarat table like a king at his throne, and he gestured toward the empty chair across from him with a theatrical flourish. "Sit," he commanded, and there was no request in his voice, only ownership. "You're going to play from me. You're going to absorb my bad luck and cleanse this table with your insignificance." Diane looked at the chair. She looked at the cards waiting to be dealt. She looked at Jung Si-woo, whose tattoo seemed to pulse with malevolent life in the low light of the chandeliers she had polished just hours before. And then, without a word, she sat down. The chair was red velvet, worn smooth by the backs of men who had won and lost kingdoms in this exact spot. It held her weight differently than it held theirs. She was lighter, smaller, less substantial in every way that mattered to them. The dealer, a different man now, his hands trembling slightly as he shuffled the cards, looked at her with something between pity and curiosity. Si-woo leaned back in his own chair, his posture deliberately relaxed, performing ease for his audience. "The rules are simple, Diane. You play until I tell you to stop. You bet what I tell you to bet. You are my puppet, and these cards are your strings." He paused, letting the threat crystallize in the air between them. "And if you embarrass me, if you cost me more money, I will make sure the only thing you clean tomorrow is your own blood off this carpet." The men around the table laughed, the sound bouncing off the crystal chandeliers in a cascade of cruel music. But Diane's expression didn't change. Her face remained a mask of professional neutrality, the kind of blankness that came from years of being looked through rather than looked at. She folded her hands on the table in front of her, her fingers interlaced with the precision of a geometry proof, and she waited. The dealer began. The cards whispered across the felt like secrets being told in the dark. Diane received her first 2 cards face down, protocol for the player position. She didn't reach for them immediately. Instead, she sat perfectly still, her breathing so controlled it appeared she might not be breathing at all. The stillness was unnatural, the kind of motionlessness that made predators uneasy, because it suggested the presence of another predator, one they hadn't noticed until now. One of the professional gamblers at the adjacent table, a Malaysian banker named Chen who had made his fortune in derivatives, leaned forward slightly. His eyes narrowed. He had played cards with everyone from Macau to Monte Carlo, and he recognized something in Diane's posture that sent a small electrical current of warning through his nervous system. That wasn't the stillness of fear. That was the stillness of a sniper controlling their heartbeat before a shot. Si-woo, oblivious to the shift in atmospheric pressure, gestured impatiently. "Well, look at your cards, Maid, or do you need me to explain how this works?" Diane's fingers moved to the cards. She lifted them with 2 hands, holding them at an angle that allowed only her to see their faces. Her expression didn't change. Not a flicker of disappointment, not a flash of excitement. Nothing. She set them back down face down on the felt with the same neutral precision she had used to lift them. "Banker," she said, quietly, her voice carrying despite its softness, each syllable articulated with the clarity of a bell being struck. Si-woo's eyebrows rose. "You're betting on banker? That's the coward's bet. That's the bet for people who don't understand risk." "Banker," she repeated, and there was no defensiveness in her tone, no explanation offered. It was a statement of fact, immovable as mathematics. Something flickered across Si-woo's face, irritation mixed with something else, something he couldn't quite name. But he had committed to this performance, and pride wouldn't let him back down in front of his men. "Fine," he snapped, 50,000 on banker." The dealer placed the chips. The cards were revealed. Banker won with a natural 8. The dealer pushed a stack of chips across the felt toward Diane's position. The room, which had been holding its breath in anticipation of humiliation, exhaled in confused silence. Si-woo's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before reasserting itself. "Lucky guess," he said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty, like a crack forming in marble. 3 more hands followed. Each time Diane's expression remained unchanged. Each time her breathing maintained that same eerie, mechanical steadiness. Each time she called her bet with quiet certainty. Player, banker, banker. And each time she won. The chip stack in front of her position grew like a living thing, multiplying in defiance of probability and expectation. By the 5th hand, the jeering had stopped. The enforcers who had mocked her were now silent, their eyes fixed on her face, searching for the trick, the tell, the explanation. Chen, the Malaysian banker, had stopped playing his own game entirely and was watching Diane with the focused intensity of a man witnessing something he couldn't categorize. And then, on the 6th hand, Diane did something unexpected. She looked up from the cards for the first time since sitting down, and her eyes met Jung Si-woo's directly. "You're drifting," she said, her voice still quiet, but somehow cutting through the silence like a scalpel through skin. Si-woo's face froze. "What did you say?" "Your focus," Diane continued, and now there was something in her voice that hadn't been there before. Not aggression, but authority. The voice of someone who had stopped asking for permission to speak. "Your place," she said softly, and for the first time, something resembling emotion crossed her face. Not fear, but a cool, analytical curiosity, as though she were observing a specimen under glass. "My place," she said, "is wherever the mathematics lead, and right now, the mathematics say you're going to lose the next hand if you bet player, which is what you're about to do, because you're overcompensating for your previous losses with aggressive positioning." Si-woo's mouth opened, then closed. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, the whites visible all around the iris. Around the table, his men shifted uncomfortably, hands drifting toward concealed weapons in a purely instinctive response to a threat they couldn't define. The dealer waited, cards in hand, frozen in the terrible space between heartbeats. The roulette wheel spun on in the corner, its metallic voice the only sound in a room that had forgotten how to breathe. Si-woo's hand slammed against the table, with enough force to make the chips jump, a few tumbling onto the floor like loose teeth. "Deal," he snarled at the dealer, his voice raw with the kind of rage that came from being dissected in public. "And you," he pointed at Diane, the finger trembling with barely contained violence, "you bet what I tell you to bet. Player, maximum." Diane's eyes remained steady, but something shifted in her posture, a microscopic relaxation, like a spring releasing tension. "As you wish, Mr. Jung," she said, and her tone was once again that of the dutiful servant, empty of challenge, stripped of the authority that had animated her words moments before. She was giving him exactly what he wanted. She was handing him the rope. The dealer's fingers moved across the felt, distributing cards with mechanical precision. Si-woo had bet 200,000 on player, a reckless amount, the kind of wager that signaled desperation masquerading as confidence. Around the table, his enforcers leaned in, their faces tense with the awareness that they were watching something dangerous unfold, though none of them could articulate exactly what. The cards came down. Player, 6. Banker, 7. Banker 1. 200,000 evaporated like morning mist, raked into the house collection with the dispassionate efficiency of a guillotine blade falling. Si-woo's breathing had become audible, a wet, ragged sound that spoke of blood pressure spiking and control slipping. But instead of retreating, instead of acknowledging the warning signs that any rational gambler would have heeded, he doubled down. "Again," he hissed, "player, 400,000. Chen, the Malaysian banker, stood up from his own table and walked away, shaking his head. He had seen this before, the death spiral, the moment when gambling stopped being a game and became a suicide attempt. He wanted no part of witnessing what came next. Diane placed the bet as instructed. Her hands were steady. Her breathing remained that eerie, controlled rhythm that made her seem more machine than woman. The cards came down. Player, 5. Banker, 8. Another loss. 400,000 gone. Si-woo's empire was hemorrhaging money, the chip stacks in front of him dwindling like a sandcastle facing the tide. But Diane had done something in those two hands that only someone watching very carefully would have noticed. She had memorized the exact sequence of cards coming from the shoe. She had counted not just the high and low cards, any competent player could do that, but the specific distribution of 8s and 9s, the positions of face cards, the gaps in probability that formed when certain combinations were removed from play. She was building a three-dimensional map of the remaining deck in her mind, each card a coordinate in a system of absolute certainty. And now, as Si-woo prepared to make his third catastrophic bet, Diane pivoted. "Mr. Jung," she said softly, and her voice was honey over arsenic, "perhaps you should trust my judgment for the next hand. I believe I've found the pattern." Si-woo's eyes locked onto hers, bloodshot and desperate. He was drowning, and she was offering him a rope. His pride warred with his panic, and panic won. "Fine," he spat, "but if you lose—" "I won't," Diane interrupted, and the certainty in her voice was absolute. It wasn't confidence, it was knowledge. She studied the table for a long moment, her eyes moving across the felt with the precision of a surgeon examining an incision site. Then she spoke. "Banker, 800,000. The room gasped. It was an obscene amount, enough to purchase a small building, enough to fund a year of someone's life. Si-woo hesitated for only a heartbeat before pushing the chips forward, his hands shaking. He had passed the point of rational thought. He was no longer gambling, he was believing. The cards came down with the weight of inevitability. Player 4, Banker 9, Natural, Banker 1. The dealer pushed a mountain of chips across the felt, the stack so high it had to be divided into multiple towers. Si-woo's breath caught in his throat. Around the room, men who had been preparing to flee were now stepping closer, drawn by the scent of blood in the water. "Again," Diane said, and now she wasn't asking permission. "Banker, 1.6 million. Si-woo didn't hesitate. He was in her current now, being pulled toward the waterfall, unable and unwilling to swim against it. The chips went into the betting circle. The cards came down. Banker won again. The chip stacks grew. Si-woo's face transformed from rage to rapture, the emotional whiplash making him look almost drunk. 3 more hands followed in rapid succession. Each time, Diane called the bet with that same eerie certainty. Each time she won. But something had changed in her betting pattern that would only become apparent in retrospect. She wasn't following traditional Baccarat strategy, which valued preservation and incremental gain. She was playing a different game entirely, one where the only goal was total annihilation of the opponent's resources. On the 8th consecutive win, Si-woo was no longer thinking. He was euphoric, the endorphins of victory flooding his system and drowning out the small voice of reason that whispered warnings in the back of his skull. He had forgotten that Diane was supposed to be his puppet. In his mind, she had become his oracle, his weapon, his salvation. "How much do I have?" demanded Si-woo of the dealer, gesturing at the chip stacks that now covered nearly a quarter of the table. The dealer's fingers moved over the towers, lips moving silently as he counted. "Approximately 4.3 million, sir." Si-woo's laugh was high and wild, the sound of a man who had looked into the abyss and convinced himself he had conquered it. He turned to his inner circle, his arms spread wide. You see what happens when fortune remembers who the fuck I am?" But Diane was looking at something else. Her eyes had drifted to the corner of the room where Park, Si-woo's scarred lieutenant, was having a whispered conversation with the pit boss, a thin man with the nervous energy of someone who had been given instructions he didn't want to follow. She watched Park's hand move to his jacket pocket and withdraw something small which he passed to the pit boss with the discretion of a drug dealer completing a transaction. She watched the pit boss nod and move toward the dealer station, where he bent down to whisper something into the dealer's ear. The air in the room suddenly felt thicker, harder to breathe, as though the atmospheric pressure had changed. Diane's expression didn't change, but her fingers moved almost imperceptibly to the small silver bird pin on her collar, adjusting it by a fraction of a millimeter. The gesture looked like nervous fidgeting. It was actually confirmation that the device was recording properly. Si-woo slammed both hands on the table, making chips rattle. "All of it," he declared, his voice booming with the false confidence of men about to drive off a cliff. "Everything. We're going all in. 4.3 million on the next hand." Around the room, his enforcers exchanged glances. This wasn't strategy, this was madness, but none of them had the courage to tell a king he was naked. Diane looked at him for a long moment, and something flickered across her face. Not quite pity, but a recognition of inevitability, the look of a doctor who knows the patient is terminal but must continue the procedure anyway. "If that's what you want, Mr. Jung," she said quietly, "then I should tell you that the smart money would be on Tai." Si-woo's eyebrows shot up. Tai was the sucker bet, the tourist trap, the wager that serious players avoided because the house edge was catastrophic, except when it hit, it paid 9-1. "Tai?" he repeated, incredulous. "The shoe is at a confluence point," Diane said, her voice taking on the quality of someone reciting mathematical formulas. "Based on the cards already played, the probability of a tie on this specific hand is approximately 11.4%, which is well above the typical 8 to 9%. With a 9-1 payout, the expected value is actually positive." It was complete nonsense, of course. She was inventing numbers, but she was inventing them with such specificity, with such clinical precision, that they sounded like divine truth. Si-woo stared at the betting circle marked tie, his face twisted in an agony of indecision. 4.3 million on a bet that almost never hit. If he won, he would walk away with nearly 40 million. If he lost, he would be left with the deed to the casino and his fleet of ships. Valuable assets, certainly, but not liquid, not immediate. His empire would survive, but his momentum would be shattered. "Do it," he whispered, and the words came out like a prayer. "Bet it all on Tai." The dealer's hands paused for just a fraction of a second, so brief that most people in the room missed it entirely. But Diane saw it. She saw the microscopic hesitation, the tell that confirmed what she had already deduced from watching Park's transaction with the pit boss. The dealer had been instructed to cheat. The cards had been marked, the shoe had been compromised, and the outcome of the next hand had already been determined. The chips were pushed into the tie circle, a mountain of currency so obscene it looked like a monument to hubris. The dealer's fingers went to the shoe, preparing to distribute the cards that would determine whether Jung Si-woo remained a king or became a cautionary tale. But Diane wasn't watching the dealer's hands, she was watching his eyes. More specifically, she was watching the cluster of micro-expressions that appeared in the muscles surrounding his eyes, what neurologists called the orbicularis oculi, the involuntary contractions that reveal authentic emotion versus performed emotion. For 3 years, she had cataloged this dealer's specific pattern of tells, the slight narrowing when he was about to deal a high card, the widening when a low card was coming, the barely perceptible upward flick when he was executing a false shuffle. Right now, his eyes were doing something she had never seen before, a rapid sequence of dilations and contractions that suggested he was under extraordinary stress, the kind of physiological response that came from being forced to participate in something dangerous. The cards came down. Player, 8, banker, 8, tie. The room exploded. Si-woo's roar of triumph was so loud it seemed to make the chandeliers shake, crystals trembling as though in fear. His enforcers surged forward, pounding the table, embracing each other, whooping like children who had just witnessed a miracle. The dealer began pushing chips across the felt in stacks so tall they had to be transported in racks, 38.7 million in total, a sum so vast it would take nearly an hour to physically count and organize. But Diane wasn't celebrating. She was sitting perfectly still, her hands folded on the table, her expression unchanged, because she understood something that Si-woo, in his euphoria, had failed to grasp. The hand had been rigged for him to win. Park had arranged the cheat to restore Si-woo's confidence, to pull him back from the edge of the spiral, to give him the chemical hit of victory that would keep him gambling until the house could systematically drain him over the following weeks and months. It was a long-game strategy, the kind casinos employed with high-value whales who needed to be managed rather than slaughtered. But Diane had called the bet knowing it would hit. She had weaponized their own cheating mechanism against them, and in doing so, she had committed them to a course of action they couldn't reverse without admitting they had rigged the game. Si-woo was standing now, his arms raised in triumph, accepting the congratulations of his men like a general who had won a decisive battle. He was drunk on success, his earlier losses forgotten, his ego restored and inflated beyond its previous dimensions. He looked at Diane, and for the first time, there was something other than contempt in his eyes. There was gratitude, there was respect, there was dependency. "One more hand," he announced, and his voice carried the absolute certainty of men who believed fortune had permanently aligned in their favor. "We're going to break this casino's back. All of it, the 38.7 million in chips, plus assets valued at approximately 80 million. Everything I have built, everything I am." His lieutenant, Park, stepped forward, his scarred face pale. "Sir, perhaps this is the moment to—" "Everything," Si-woo roared, spinning to face his advisor with eyes that had gone beyond bloodshot into something more alarming, the glassy, unfocused stare of someone whose brain chemistry had been hijacked by their own neurotransmitters. "Do you doubt me, Park? Do you doubt that fortune herself has declared me her champion?" Park stepped back, hands raised, in surrender. No one in the room had the power to stop what was about to happen. They were passengers in a vehicle whose brakes had been cut, careening towards a cliff that only Diane could see clearly. She watched Si-woo gather the deed to the casino from his inner jacket pocket, a thick document bound in leather, embossed with gold leaf. She watched him signal to another enforcer, who made a phone call and then nodded, confirming that the shipping company's ownership documents were being prepared for transfer. These weren't just assets, they were the foundations of Si-woo's empire, the infrastructure that allowed him to move money and contraband across international waters, the legitimate businesses that laundered the profits from operations that could never see daylight. The dealer was no longer the same man who had been standing there moments before. His hands were shaking visibly now, and a thin film of sweat had appeared on his forehead. He looked toward the pit boss, who looked towards Park, who looked towards Si-woo, trying to communicate something urgently with his eyes alone. But Si-woo was beyond receiving signals. He slammed the deed onto the table. "This is the wager," he declared. 38.7 million in chips, plus assets valued at approximately 80 million. Everything I have built, everything I am. The room had gone silent again. But this time, the silence was different. It was the silence of men witnessing something they knew they shouldn't be seeing. The silence of people who had just realized they were standing at ground zero of an explosion. Diane looked at the mountain of chips, at the deed with its gold leaf embossing, at Jung Si-woo's face flushed with the certainty of invincibility, and then she did something that made every person in the room stop breathing. She smiled. It was not a large smile. It was not theatrical or mocking. It was the small, private smile of someone who had just watched the final piece of a complex puzzle click into place. "Mr. Jung," she said, and her voice was different now, no longer the neutral tone of a servant, but something else entirely, something that carried the weight of authority and the cold precision of a prosecutor reading an indictment. "Before we proceed, I should tell you who I am." Si-woo's expression flickered with confusion, then irritation. "What are you—" "My name is Diane Rogers," she continued, speaking over him with the quiet force of someone who no longer needed permission to speak. "For the past 3 years, I have worked as a maid in this establishment, but before that, I was a forensic accountant for an international task force investigating transnational organized crime. I specialized in following money through shell corporations, in identifying patterns in financial transactions that indicated money laundering, human trafficking, and arms dealing." The color began draining from Si-woo's face like water from a broken dam. Around the room, hands moved toward weapons, but no one drew them. They were frozen, waiting to understand the shape of the threat before responding. "I came to this casino," Diane continued, her voice never rising but somehow filling the entire space, "because my family was threatened by the syndicate you represent. My daughter was photographed walking to school. My mother received calls in the middle of the night. I was told that if I continued my investigation, if I testified at the trial, if I helped put your organization's leadership in prison, I would lose everything I loved." Her hand moved to the small silver bird pin on her collar, and now she removed it completely, holding it up so that it caught the light from the chandelier above. "This pin has been recording every conversation in this room for 1,095 days. Every bribe you've negotiated, every threat you've made, every discussion of shipments that contained human cargo, every mention of accounts in jurisdictions that don't ask questions, all of it, documented, time-stamped, ready for delivery to the same task force I used to work for." Si-woo's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The transformation in his face was total, the arrogance collapsing like a building with its supports removed, revealing the terrified child beneath the gangster mask. "But the recording was never the endgame," Diane said, and now she stood, rising from the red velvet chair with the fluid grace of someone shedding a costume. "This endgame was this moment, this table, this bet. You were going to wager everything you own, everything you've built on the backs of people you've exploited and brutalized, on one more hand of cards, and you were going to lose." "No," Si-woo whispered, the word barely audible. "No, I was going to win. The last hand, I won." "The last hand was rigged," Diane said, and now she pointed at the dealer, whose face had gone the color of old newspaper. "Your Lieutenant Park arranged it to restore your confidence, to keep you gambling, but I knew it was rigged, so I called the bet that would hit. I used your own cheating mechanism to build your stack high enough that you would bet everything. I engineered your euphoria, I manufactured your certainty, and now you're going to lose it all, because this hand won't be rigged. This hand will be pure probability, and the house always wins in the end." Si-woo looked around the room desperately, seeking allies, seeking exits, seeking anything that could reverse the momentum of what was happening, but his enforcers had taken steps backward, their hands empty, their faces carefully neutral. They had heard the confession about the recording device. They understood that staying loyal to Si-woo now meant being documented participants in his crimes. Park, the scarred lieutenant, was the first to move. He walked to the exit with the measured pace of someone who had survived this long by knowing exactly when to abandon a sinking ship. Others followed. Within 30 seconds, half the room had emptied. "Deal the cards," Diane said, and her voice carried absolute command.
Si-woo reached for something in his jacket, whether it was a weapon or a phone or simply a desperate reflex, no one would ever know because Park's voice cut through the room from the doorway. "Don't. It's over." The dealer's hands moved. The cards came down. Player, 6. Banker, 7. Banker 1. The mountain of chips, the deed with its gold leaf embossing, the ownership documents for a shipping fleet, all of it swept into the house collection in one fluid motion.
Jung Si-woo's knees buckled. He didn't fall dramatically. He simply folded, his body crumpling as though every bone had suddenly turned to water. He knelt on the floor beside the table where he had ruled for 15 years, his pristine black suit collecting dust, his intricate neck tattoo pulsing with his racing heartbeat, and he made a sound that was neither a word nor a cry, but something more fundamental, the sound of a man realizing he had been reduced to nothing. Diane looked down at him, and her expression held no triumph, no satisfaction, only a cold, clinical observation. "The assets will be transferred to a trust fund for the families of the people you've exploited," she said. "The workers who cleaned your floors, the women who were trafficked through your ships, the men who died in your debt. They'll receive what you stole from them. And you," she paused, considering, "you'll work for them. You'll clean floors in the buildings they now own. You'll earn minimum wage. You'll learn what it feels like to be invisible." She turned toward the exit, her sensible black shoes clicking against the marble floor with the same rhythm they had carried for 3 years. But now each step sounded different to the men who remained, not the shuffle of a servant, but the measured stride of a lioness who had finished her hunt. At the doorway, she paused and looked back one final time. Si-woo was still on his knees, staring at the empty space where his empire had been. Around him, the few enforcers who hadn't fled were looking at each other with the dawning awareness that the world had changed in a way they couldn't change back. "Gentlemen," said Diane, and her voice carried no mockery, only a statement of fact, "you will never look at a servant the same way again." Then she walked out into the night, leaving behind a room that smelled of expensive scotch and shattered certainty, where crystal chandeliers she had polished continued to sparkle with indifferent beauty, catching the light and throwing it into shadows that had always been there, waiting to be seen.